Hey, it's Jordan with Status Coup. Delighted to be joined by Nick Estes. He's a citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux Tribe, journalist, historian, and the host of the Red Nation podcast. He's the author of Our History is the Future, which I have right here. You can see. I'm not going to lie, I haven't finished the whole thing because I barely have time to go to the bathroom these days, but I'm a couple chapters in. It's really good. And yeah, it's really, you managed to like weave in the battle at Standing Rock, which, even though it was many years ago, there's still lessons to be learned, and the fight to stop that pipeline, but also such rich indigenous history, colonialism, empire. So I really encourage people to check it out. Our History is the Future. But yeah, I wanted to have you on kind of free flowing discussion because I feel like, you hear in media right now kind of this we have to learn to live with it with COVID. But I really, aside from here and there, some stories, about tribes that were hit particularly hard. Um, you don't really hear much about COVID and indigenous communities, and it's ravaged indigenous communities. So I thought that's a good place to start. Can you kind of talk about, because obviously indigenous communities already have such pre-existing conditions, high rates of cancer, and other things. How has COVID affected, from your tribe to other indigenous communities?
Yeah, for sure. So I wrote a piece in the the Baffler, sort of at the beginning of the peak of the pandemic in 2020, kind of dissecting how COVID-19 has impacted tribal communities, and specifically, looking at the very things that you're talking about, this idea of pre-existing conditions, but really thinking about it in the context of communicable diseases and the history of indigenous genocide. And you can't disentangle, the two. Like, we're living in a moment of pandemic, and there's a reason why certain people are more prone to not only getting a virus or getting a communicable disease, but dying from it. As we know, as we're seeing, this peak with Omicron, even though there is, less severity in some ways, more people are vaccinated, you still see increased rates of hospitalization and long-term effects of COVID-19. And just to kind of, there's a lot to say about it, but I just want to say one thing that's incredibly important is that despite the structural barriers, despite the lack of funding on behalf of the federal government in meeting its fiduciary responsibilities to tribal nations through the Indian Health Services, COVID-19 vaccinations in American Indian communities is over 90%. We're one of the most highly vaccinated populations in the United States. That said, there are a lot of structural issues still going on. So, for example, in the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, which isn't the reservation I'm from, but it's nearby, they have about I just read a report last week that said they had a 35% positivity rate for COVID-19. So even with the kind of measures that they've taken, they've kept up their health checkpoints. So to enter the reservation as a member or a citizen or a visitor, you have to go through a health screening checkpoint, which they ask you a series of questions. You have to tell where you're going, and this is because they're surrounded by a state, South Dakota, which has literally done nothing to stop the spread of COVID-19, not just amongst indigenous people, but also against non-indigenous people. And it's
Not
quite
only did
horrific.
not only did nothing, the governor was trying to end those checkpoints and
Oh,
battled.
exactly.
I believe it was with the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe in South Dakota. She was trying to, whatever, play to her
She was trying to
base.
deploy the National Guard, is what
Yeah,
she was doing.
to
She threatened to,
basically
at least.
to interfere with tribal sovereignty and Cheyenne River Sioux tribe's ability to have that checkpoint up.
Yeah, and the Kristi Noem has been kind of a thorn in the, but she's also the Oglala Sioux tribe has formally kind of banished her from the reservation. So there's this hostile relationship. Obviously she's aligned with the kind of Trump wing of the Republican Party. I would say that she's often to the right of even many of those people. So yeah, so you have this this kind of confluence, not just of a pandemic, but at the intersection of states' rights and aggression towards tribal sovereignty and eroding it. And at the same time, you have a kind of inbuilt collective response that I think has been very appropriate in this situation, because even when their vaccines weren't available in non-Indigenous communities back home in South Dakota, but also where I used to live in New Mexico. The tribal clinics, the tribal hospitals that had excess vaccines were opening it up to non-Indigenous people to come get vaccinated. So even despite the kind of structural barriers of colonialism, white supremacy, and just outright hostility towards Native people, there's kind of been an inbuilt, value system of collective kind of solidarity in this particular moment in time. And again, going back to this idea that somehow there's these pre-existing conditions. At the very beginning of this pandemic, we had said, many communities have said, not just the people I work with, but many communities have said that the pre-existing condition has always been colonialism, the continued occupation of our lands and the usurpation of our sovereignty, because we wouldn't be in this situation had we had the opportunity to have adequate healthcare, have housing, have clean drinking water.
Right.
So these are a lot of issues that are pre-existing to the pandemic itself.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask about that because, in my view, I mean, the infrastructure deal that Biden and the Democrats, as of now, is one of the only things they could really cite. To me, it's privatizations on steroids. It's really only $500 billion in new money. Experts have said we need trillions of dollars to meet our crumbling infrastructure. But within it, there was, so they say, provisions for rural broadband, which could help Indigenous communities, fixing sewage and water waste systems, this and that. Can you kind of talk about, are there things in the infrastructure deal that actually are helping Indigenous communities, and have you seen that yet?
Yeah, I mean, even before that, in the CARES Act, just to go back to the COVID-19, it was like providing funding it was creating jobs on the reservation where there hadn't been jobs. Like, I spoke about the health checkpoint thing, and you know, it may be creating like 100 jobs, but that's huge. And it also shows that it's not, people are unemployed because they don't want to work, right? It's kind of this weird thing where it's like you have the mass, we have the Great Resignation, which is going on, which is people who are refusing to work because of the conditions, in the workplace, the low wages, the lack of healthcare, all of those situations. But then on the other hand, when there is kind of a collective sense of good that one is providing by doing health checkpoints, yeah, of course, people want to work those jobs. And obviously this new infrastructure bill, I mean, as you brought up, it is in many ways like a privatization scheme. But we have to ask ourselves, like the kinds of issues that are facing Indian country in terms of the reservation populations have been, long-standing. I mean, I remember back in 2011 in my home community when the Lower Brule Reservation, when I was living there, one of the main roads, there's three main roads that go into town, and two of them had washed away, leaving one entrance into town. And it was like, all it was is because the federal government hadn't replaced culverts, in a drainage system. And so, just like the basic access, to grocery stores and things like that, we live, everywhere you look in the reservation that I come from, and the place that I come from is a massive food production factory. There's cattle being raised, there's corn being raised, but you can't find a fresh tomato on the reservation. There's a reason for it. It's imposed scarcity in a land of abundance, and infrastructure has a large role to play in how we access those kinds of things. And so, on one hand, it's like we should absolutely be critical of the infrastructure bill, but on the other hand, it's like, why is it that basic treaty rights, basic human rights, are held up by people like Joe Manchin, by Kristen Sinema, but then also there's a cynical kind of calculation that is always at play in terms of like, why can't these just be everybody's rights? It's not just for Indigenous people. Everybody needs housing. Everybody needs healthcare. Everybody needs roads and clean water, or broadband internet service.
Yeah. Biden, he didn't really run per se on any policies. I mean, maybe a $15 minimum wage, which he abandoned in 5 minutes. But he ran on restoring the soul of the nation. Well, I'm not indigenous, but I was at Standing Rock for many months on the ground covering that. And as a non-indigenous person, that was a rude awakening for me to see what the soul of the nation really is. And that is murder, kidnapping, genocide, rape. And basically, after all that, never atoning for it and making indigenous people basically beg for their land, beg for rights, and things like that. So to me, of all the broken promises of the Biden administration, in fairness, he's been dealing with a pandemic, but of all the broken promises, he did say a whole lot of things about, indigenous rights, about pipelines. He, for some reason, felt we have to shut down Keystone XL, but I'll keep Dakota Access Pipeline going, which, could poison the water of 20 million people downstream of the Missouri River. I don't think there's any way to know how many times it has already spilled because we know that the oil companies are not going to report it accurately. Line 3, we saw federal officials terrorizing DHS, terrorizing water protectors and protesters. So it seems to me same old with the Biden administration when it comes to big oil being able to have their way with indigenous land reservations. He said we're going to stop drilling on public lands. It's only gone up. So can you kind of talk about, I know I've thrown a bunch of different things at you, but essentially it was all lip service because great, Keystone was shut down. Everything else is open for business and pumping toxic oil and natural gas.
Yeah, no, you raise amazing points and questions there. And I just want to say, the images of our generation, of this moment of climate justice, come from the images that you and I witnessed firsthand at Standing Rock, in those protests. That was under Obama's administration. That wasn't a Trump concocted policy. Like the majority of arrests and police repression and state repression, federal infiltration, the felonies that were slapped on protesters, everything that we witnessed, that the eviction of the 1851 treaty camp, all of that stuff, the pulling of elders from half naked from ceremonies, from sweat lodge ceremonies, the macing, the urination on sacred items, we saw all that. We saw the police do all of those things. You can't remove those images from our head, like whether you saw them in person or whether you saw them on the internet. That is Obama's legacy, period. Like there's no other way to get around that. We can get mad at Trump, fast tracking the approval in the EIS process, post Obama, but there was nothing guaranteed to prevent him to do so. There were concrete actions that could have taken place prior to that. And it's not enough he visited Standing Rock in 2014. He's like one of the few sitting presidents to visit an Indian reservation during his presidency. It's like there's no way that he didn't know. And to go to the point about Keystone XL, it's like, yeah, sure, Biden recanceled, the Keystone, the northern leg of the Keystone XL pipeline. It's important to point out that Obama also approved, the 3/4 of the southern leg of the Keystone XL pipeline. So we can't actually fully credit Obama for canceling that pipeline, but we can go back and look at his logic and say, well, he was doing so because, this was part of, America's energy independence policy where, we were going to wean off, oil from, conflict-ridden countries like Venezuela or Iran or Saudi Arabia. And also you see this kind of amplification of a sanctions regime that he imposes on Iran and Venezuela at the same time that they're building these, domestic pipeline infrastructure, which includes the Keystone XL pipeline, as well as the Dakota Access pipeline. So he's using, sort of these geopolitical maneuvers against what he sees as, enemies of the United States, and developing, domestic oil infrastructure while using that justification to say, well, the Keystone XL, the northern leg of the Keystone XL pipeline, because it crosses an international border, it falls outside of our domestic energy strategy. And so we're going to cancel that. And it's kind of like throwing, a peace, a peace offering to climate activists. And so when Biden comes into, office, that's, he's just reinstating Obama era policy But at the same time, and it's almost like deja vu. It's almost like forgive the analogy, but it's like Groundhog's Day with Bill Murray, where it's like,
Yep.
we are Bill Murray and we're waking up, but it's the same day. So under Biden's administration, a similar situation has unfolded with the Line 3 pipeline, except that, okay, we have the images of the water protectors. We have, I was there, I saw it. It was, quite horrific and also quite surreal, because you had Minnesota was having a historic drought, once in a lifetime drought. There were forest fires that were, darkening the skies, the moon, the sun was red. You had to wear a mask, not because of just COVID-19, but because the air was so toxic from all of the the wildfires that were blown down from Canada, obviously amplified and intensified because of climate change. And then you have this pipeline, this dirty tar sands pipeline that is equivalent to over 400 or 350 coal-fired power plants, which is expected to emit carbon that is double the amount that the entire state of Minnesota emits in a single year. And then you have, at the same time, Biden saying, declaring a code red, on climate because of the wildfires, the out of control wildfires in the West. So there's this complete disconnect in the reality of what's happening. But at the same time, you have indigenous activists, you have water protectors who are getting brutalized by the police, who are literally collecting a paycheck from an escrow account that is being, funded by Enbridge, the Canadian pipeline company that's building Line 3. And so, we canceled, Keystone XL pipeline because it was going to it was part of the Obama era legacy and promise that, Biden wanted to uphold. But in reality, Line 3 is just a reroute, because it's taking the same tar sands and transporting it, to this in the same direction down to the Gulf of Mexico for refinement. And on top of that, we also have, a form of identity politics that has, superseded even the Obama administration, if you can imagine this. I mean, here in the state of Minnesota, the lieutenant governor, Peggy Flanagan, is from, the White Earth Reservation, which is directly impacted by Line 3. Above her, you have, the acting secretary of the Army Corps of Engineers, Jamie Pinkham, who is a Nez Perce, and a member of the Nez Perce Nation. And then above him, you have, or next to him, I should say, you have somebody like Deb Haaland, who actually began her political career, her elected political career in office while she was in the camps at Standing Rock. And each one of these people holds an incredible amount of power and sway over the future of an oil pipeline. You have at the federal level, you have the Department of Interior, literally a cabinet level position next to Biden, who has his ear. And then you have the Army Secretary of the Army Corps of Engineers, who can write an email and say, hey, maybe we're going about this project the wrong way. And then you have Peggy Flanagan, who just wrote a Facebook post opposing Line 3. But as far as, any other kind of substantial option we have, we don't really know how she's actually, met the kind of the demands of many of the tribal people who were impacted, but also the citizens of the state that stood up against that pipeline. So there's all these large questions. We have brown faces in high places, but what has fundamentally changed? And on top of that, we have kind of a scattershot approach to canceling certain fossil fuel projects, but letting others go through, like we saw, with the recent court case, that it was revealed that the Department of Interior had basically expanded, even though it wasn't required to by the courts, expanded how the acreage of offshore drilling that they could do in the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah.
It was completely uncalled for. Should have been a national news story, but it wasn't, because our guys are in power right now. And so I think it's just a very cynical approach to politics right now.
Well, also, let's keep it real. There seems to be a bit of a conflict here, right? On one end, you have the Democrat. I mean, we know Republicans don't care about the climate catastrophe, but Democrats say they do. They talked about, in Build Back Better, that was going to be the biggest climate investment in America's history. If you actually look at it, it was about $500 billion dollars. But underneath the hood, it was a lot of tax incentives, nothing with real teeth. But I say conflict because who's invested in all these pipelines? Who's invested in all these projects? Wall Street. So Wall Street, I mean, Dakota Access Pipeline, you had every bank in the Rolodex was invested in that and all these other things. So the Democratic Party, they say they want to combat the climate catastrophe. But the truth is, it's not just big oil that's making money off of these pipelines. It's Wall Street donors, powerful people. And if they actually went after fracking, these pipelines, uranium mining, their donors have money invested in all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I mean, even the recent comments by Nancy Pelosi, who was kind of challenged on this. Her husband is an investment banker, and the challenges on her about her connections to Wall Street and making these decisions. She was just like, well, are we not supposed to be capitalist, essentially? And it's like, it just exposed the system for what it is, that a lot of these politicians, if they're not directly tied to these corporations themselves, or in some ways and sometimes benefiting from the profit margins that are being made, they're beholden to a donor class who's pumping money and keeping them into power to begin with. And I think it's also important to point out that, while it is the fossil fuel industry that we should be keeping our eye on, the fossil fuel industry itself has also diversified its portfolio and is beginning to invest in green renewable technology, which there's a larger question that we should approach around. Why is it that the very perpetrators of the climate catastrophe are now being seen as the kind of arbiters of justice or transition that is needed to transition away from fossil fuels? And if you look at even Biden's Build Back Better program and wanting to electrify the federal fleet, which I think is a noble aspiration, we have to ask ourselves, like, where is that copper going to come from?
Right.
Where are the minerals that are going to go into those renewable technologies going to come from? It's the same question that we approached in 2008 when Obama was like, we need to develop America's domestic energy supplies so that we don't have to be, it was a very nationalistic approach. But he, in his tenure in office, he, increased, domestic oil production increased by 88%, right? And so what we're seeing now is kind of a new frontier of looking at, tribal nations, not explicitly, but in practice, whether it's at Thacker Pass, where they're trying to build a lithium mine in Nevada, which is, sacred Paiute land, or at Oak Flat, where they're trying to build, a copper mine, which would, provide, like, I think they said it would be like the second largest supplier of copper ore for America's, energy and green renewable needs. So these technologies and these transitions and this, demand, ever increasing demand for energy always comes at a cost. And we live in a system where it's like those costs are always externalized, it seems like, on those with the least amount of power. And in this case, it's Indigenous people and Indigenous communities, just the same way it was with the fossil fuel industry. And so unless we're interested in overturning that structure or changing that relationship, we're going to wind up at the same place.
And lastly, speaking of overturning structures, you tweet, and this tweet really stood out to me. I wanted to highlight it. So you said, imagine your pilgrim military, tanks and all, is occupying indigenous islands and polluting water in the Pacific. All this to, quote, contain China. And you have the arrogance to call people opposing this blatant colonialism tankies, while also calling for sanctions on China. I think I know what you were talking about here, but I wanted to ask you about it because obviously right now it's appalling that this has not been covered. But you have what's going on in Hawaii at Red Hill, which the Navy has basically been poisoning the water in Pearl Harbor and the surrounding areas, apparently for decades. There have been activists indigenous people in Hawaii that have been organizing and screaming about this forever. The Navy said nothing to see here. It's our jet fuel and diesel fuel. Yeah, it's leaking, but it's not actually in the water. Well, it's in the water. And we don't know at this point how many people have been sick. It hasn't really been covered by the mainstream media that much, but I kind of assumed part of that tweet was referencing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it goes back to the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which I think was a good, applause to the Biden administration for doing that, but that should have never happened in the first place. First of all, that war, in Afghanistan was completely devastating to the country. But I think, when we think about the withdrawal of those troops, there was this, I was watching CNN or I don't remember what I was watching. I don't have cable television, so I always watch it at my dad's place. And so that's where I kind of see this stuff. But they were talking about these troops going to Guam. And I was like, it kind of, I have friends who are Chamorro, they're the indigenous people of Guam. And it's important to remember that Guam just submitted, an application to the United Nations for formal decolonization from the United States because it has historically been serving as essentially an aircraft carrier for, the projection of U.S. military power in the region because its proximity to North Korea as well as China. And so while we can applaud the withdrawal of federal troops, or the withdrawal of the military from Afghanistan, those troops don't just disappear. That military infrastructure just doesn't disappear. It just goes somewhere else. And I think that's the question that we're always constantly challenging the United States on in terms of its military presence and its military prowess, especially in the Pacific region, because while there was a little bit of détente with Trump towards China, obviously there was a lot of racialized language that he used, both externally to the Chinese government, but then also internally against Asian Americans here on the continent. There was a re-upping in the Biden administration of Obama's commitment as a pivot towards Asia, and we see the AUKUS agreement, which is a trade agreement. Much like in the Cold War, we saw the creation of NATO and these treaty alliances to kind of contain the Soviet Union and to build a hysteria around the threat that the Soviet Union posed to democracy and freedom. The only difference here is that the AUKUS kind of alliance or coalition, it's not only about selling nuclear submarines to Australia and actually it's selling tanks, selling Abraham tanks to Australia now. I don't know why Australia needs tanks, but apparently they need US made tanks. But it's to protect shipping lanes in the Pacific. And you have to ask yourself, what shipping lanes are in the Pacific that go to Britain, that go to Australia, that go to the United States? It's shipping lanes coming from China. So, and to protect from whom? China, right? That's the underlying logic here. So so you want to protect shipping lanes for a trade route coming from China, from the Chinese military. The logic doesn't make sense, but we have to look at the impact of it, because it's a militarization of places like Guam. It's a militarization of places like Hawaii, right? Where these places, these island nations and island indigenous people have historically been sacrificed for the gains and the aspirations of U.S. empire, right? When Trump was, raising tensions with North Korea, what was the site? What was the place that was under threat for nuclear annihilation? It was Guam, right? As if this is a throwaway place for both, the United States and its enemies. And so that it puts, when we talk about, imperialism and we talk about things like RIMPAC, we talk about Red Hill is a necessary fueling station for the United States to continue its military presence in the Pacific and military domination in that region. But it's also essential for war games, to continue, like RIMPAC, right? I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it's where hundreds of thousands of military personnel essentially run war games exercises in China's back door as a threat to both China and Russia and North Korea, to say we're here, this is our territory. And so this is the alternative that the United States is proposing for this region. And it's also important to point out that we just came out of COP26, militaries were excluded from those conversations, right? When in fact, the United States military is the single largest institutional consumer of oil, and correspondingly is like the single largest producer of greenhouse gases in the world. It produces more greenhouse gases than 130 nations combined, but yet it is somehow exempt from any kind of global climate policy. And so the very island nations who are suffering from military occupation are also suffering from, global sea rise. And so it's like this double bind. And I think we need to reimagine and rethink about how not only we're thinking about US imperialism as kind of this great powers game, but also understanding how the indigenous people and how indigenous sovereignty is an alternative and a real pathway towards peace and demilitarization, especially in a place like the Pacific Ocean.
Absolutely. And I also think at the end of the day, I mean, Jamal Khashoggi was murdered by Saudi Arabia. We're still selling weapons to Saudi Arabia under the guise, oh no, these weapons aren't being used to commit genocide on Yemen.
Right.
They are. We're
Right.
still droning half the world. So this colonialism and imperialism you talk about, that's just the gift that keeps coming. The gift that keeps going all around the world.
Absolutely. And it begins with understanding the function of these 800 or more military installations that are dotting the globe. And there's a lot to be said about, a lot of these issues. And I know there's a lot of opinions and feelings that people have towards China, but until we can actually confront the real threat, especially those facing indigenous people that have committed, acts of genocide and war, like dropping nuclear bombs, on entire nations of people, they still haven't recovered from that. We need to begin a serious conversation in the United States and asking ourselves, how is it that this military, year after year, there's no debate on funding. It's like I can even remember, like, the numbers are so astronomical, they're ridiculous at the end of the day. It's like I lived in a state where there was on the Navajo Nation, where 10% of people didn't have running water, almost a third didn't have electricity in their homes, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is the most advanced country in the world. And the place where they got a lot of the uranium for these nuclear weapons came from the Navajo Nation, right?
Right.
And not only that, just not too far away from that is, where the Manhattan Project was developed on sacred Tewa lands. And those bombs, that were developed there were then used on other indigenous people in the Pacific. And so when we think, and then on top of that, we keep going and going, but, on top of that, the southern corner of the state of Nevada is Paiute land. Right. And they were removed from there to drop nuclear weapons. And that's the most nuclear bombed place in the entire world. There's over 800 nuclear explosions that have happened in that particular location. And so when we talk about these things, it's like, it often is, okay, I'll bring up an example and then I'll shut up and we can end the show. But in the new movie, Don't Look Up, that opening scene where, Jennifer Lawrence and Leonardo DiCaprio discover the planet destroying comet that's, hurtling towards Earth is at the Subaru telescope location, which is on the sacred mountain of Mauna Kea. And what happened at Mauna Kea? We had this amazing, beautiful protest from the Kanaka Maoli people to protect that sacred site. And they made specific demands. It's not just about, oh, we're against science, right? It's about the fact that the only reason this constellation of telescopes and observatories exist on this sacred mountain is because of the continued military occupation of our homelands. It's a missed opportunity by those filmmakers to address that larger thing. If you want to talk about climate change, you got to talk about colonialism.
Absolutely. And by the way, real quick, I don't know if you saw it, but I watched White Lotus on HBO. Which I would really encourage people to watch it. It's kind of a dark comedy-ish, but it really has some takeaways about colonialism, wealthy white people, basically, overtaking indigenous land in Hawaii, and then those indigenous people in Hawaii having to basically entertain wealthy white people who come down there for vacation. It was really interesting in my view. So thank you so much, Nick. I'd love to have you back to talk about more of these things. Nick Estes, host of the Red Nation podcast, author of Our History is the Future. Definitely check it out. It's a mix of insight from the front lines on Standing Rock, as well as a very thorough history of U.S. empire, colonialism, and all those terrible things. Thanks again.
Thanks so much for having me, Jordan.